That's right. You are in the right place. Tom Cruise may have to wear shades, but I don't. I'm Dr. Greg Parsons, and this is week 4 of DBA760. So, as usual, we're going to have a set of required readings in the assignment. This week we're going to be moving on into the resource-based theories, of which Jay Barney is one of the primary authors. Still currently writing. There's a lot of current information provided by him. By the way, Michael Porter is still actively writing also, and I'll talk a little bit more about his current work coming up. So again, have a series of articles that are going to be the basis of our discussion. You're going to do 4 posts on 4 separate days. You need to get your first one in by Tuesday evening, and we're going to be basically reviewing the literature for the week and how this is the next phase of strategic management theory and how that is going to add to the field. Okay, so not that much different. It's just a new topic that's going to add to our understanding of another piece of the elephant. Week 4 is also going to have another paper. This will be your second in a series. And the way I do this is I start out with a fairly low-weighted, shorter paper just to get an idea about your writing level skills and any questions you have about what I'm looking for in terms of the writing. Okay, you get your feedback and see what I think of it, and then coming up with this paper, this one's worth quite a bit more, and I expect to see some improvements. And here we're going to be looking at the 3 main authors in the area of strategic management that we've been reading about, Mintzberg, Porter, and Barney, and we're going to be contrasting and comparing those authors. But before we get off this subject, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the review of the papers that you sent in for the first week. And in general, they were pretty good. There were some problems in some specific areas, but for the most part, given that I'm have a large sample in this particular class, they were pretty good for the first paper. And you covered most of the basics. The mechanics were not that bad. The structure was pretty well organized. You stayed on topic and so on. And so the most common feedback that I gave you on the rubric was in the area of the thesis statement, your transitions, and synthesizing. Okay? So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking a bit more about what I mean in these areas, since it's kind of hard to explain everything in the short form that I'm using on the rubric. A thesis statement, if you haven't heard this before, it's basically a summary of what your position you're going to be taking in your paper. It's the summary of the argument you're going to be making. You may, be thinking, well, we're not supposed to have an opinion. We're not supposed to take a position. Well, you are supposed to take a position. You have to, just to write a paper, you have to decide how you're going to do it and what approach you're going to take. The thesis statement merely says you have to say it. You have to tell the reader, tell me, what your particular position is on this particular paper, what you're trying to do. And then for the rest of the paper, the body of the paper is going to be organizing and presenting the evidence that will persuade the reader that your interpretation, your approach, makes sense. Okay? So in a lot of cases, I just didn't see a strong idea about what you were trying to do. And without the thesis statement, it's difficult to do the other pieces, to do the synthesis and to do the transitions, because you don't feel like you're really making an argument. You're simply telling me, well, this article said this, and this article said this, and this theory said this, and this theory said this. And so you're just basically reporting on something as opposed to drawing things together to make a particular argument. Okay? So once you've got your thesis statement, then it's important to use transitions. Transitions are the sentences or paragraphs that connect the different pieces of your paper together and show how they're logically connected. Okay? So the reader shouldn't have to figure out, well, what does this have to do with this? 1 minute you're talking about this, now you're talking about this. How does that relate to anything? Okay, so the transitions connect the pieces together, and on some of the comments I mentioned, the paper needs to flow better. It needs to move from one idea to the next logically so the reader kind of keeps up to speed with what you're doing. Also, the transitions connect the individual points that you're trying to make, the sections, back to the thesis statement. So you have to remind the reader, this is how this piece connects to my thesis. This is what I'm trying to tell you. So this proves this particular aspect of it. Okay? So I think with those two things in mind, then the idea that you need to use synthesis to pull the information out of the articles and then to use it to make your argument. Okay, you can't simply just lay things out there and say, well, this author said this author said this article said this. You have to then show the reader how those things contribute to your argument to prove your thesis statement. Without synthesis, it would be like going to court as an attorney and simply putting a pair of gloves here and a roll of duct tape here and a plastic bag here and a bloody knife here and a pair of boots here and sort of say, okay, there's my evidence. And everybody would think, well, what does it have to do with this argument you're trying to make? You have to show us how these things all connect together and how they prove your particular case. Okay. Kind of the same thing going on here. And I think if you remember these three things as you move into the next paper, you'll have a better idea of how we're going to move your writing up to the next level, so we're not merely doing reporting on something, reporting on the literature. We're now beginning to actually say something about the literature. Okay, streams of literature. This was the assignment question that I required a response on. And for those of you who've seen this in a previous class, I apologize. It's pretty much the same thing. But it's useful for everybody to have a kind of a common understanding of what we're talking about. So, streams of literature are all the published material about something. Better material is from peer-reviewed, top-notch journals. That's kind of the gold standard. As we move down in terms of non-peer-reviewed or non-gold standard journals and into trade journals and into even good publications like the Wall Street Journal or the Harvard Business Review, they're not peer-reviewed, so they don't kind of measure up to the same level of evidence that we are using when we try to review these articles and use them as support for an argument we're trying to make. Generally, a lit review, when you're writing it for your dissertation, tries to stay within a particular stream of literature. And I'll talk about why this is important in a second. So what can be a subject for a stream of literature? Could it be anything? Sure, could be almost anything. But some things are so broad that it's very difficult to possibly do a complete review of all the literature. And some things are too narrow. So for example, since you haven't gotten into your leadership classes yet, you might think, well, leadership, that would be a good stream of literature. However, once you go in and start investigating, you'll find that leadership has hundreds of theories, has millions of articles written about it from all different angles, different perspectives. So if you thought strategic management was a poorly defined area of research and a poorly defined academic field, leadership is even worse. Okay, so you have to kind of start to narrow yourself down. On the other hand, some literature or some subjects that you might be interested in at this point in time don't have a theoretical basis and don't have any peer-reviewed journal articles in the area that you're interested in. I had a student recently who wanted to work with social media. And we tried and tried, but we couldn't find anything that was directly related to social media in the type of topic that she wanted to work with. She couldn't find a stream of literature that connected social media to leadership. Okay, so consequently it didn't work. So let's just quickly run down a graphical representation. So this is from my management class. And so a stream of literature in management theory, if we start with the foundational work, you might look at Frederick Taylor and Henri Fayol, and then Max Weber, and we move down the stream, and then we have Mary Parker Follett and Elton Mayo. Abraham Maslow came in here with his ideas of motivation and how they contribute to management. Then there's George Miller and Kenneth Boulding, Herb Simon. Now we're down into the contingency theories of management and systems theories, and then Lawrence and Lorsch were kind of like the bottom end of the stream as it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so the idea is theory builds upon theory, and we can kind of trace through history with any particular theory, kind of its origin, what did it start with, and where did it end up. Now you might say, well, Taylor, he was, in the 1800s. How could he possibly have anything to do with what we're talking about now? Well, the way theory works is if it's a good theory and is based upon sound evidence, some of the DNA of that theory will be passed on down into more modern theories. So it's good, and part of a literature review, again, is knowing the seminal research in the area and who the seminal authors were that began the whole field. And here, of course, Taylor and Fayol and Weber are all considered, primary authors in this field. But I'd also like to point out how any particular part of this river of literature has its own contribution. So if we look at Herbert Maslow and how he fit in, he was the guy who talked about the hierarchy of needs and how you have to satisfy your physiological needs first. You have to have food and water to be able to survive, but once those are satisfied, then you're motivated by a higher level need. So Maslow contributed to the theory of management because obviously to manage, you have to know what motivates people, and so you have to supply the things that are going to get people to do their job. But Maslow wasn't just by himself. There were also other contributors in the area of motivational theory. Aldafer and Max Neef and Hertzberg talked about the hygiene and the motivator satisfiers of motivation. Murray had a system of needs, and McGregor, of course, was famous for theory X, theory Y. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is with what I call the trees of literature. And this is a slightly different approach because it shows that when you pick any particular theory, for example, contingency theory, well, that's based upon previous theories. We've seen that with strategic management. So contingency theory, whether you agree with it or not, for example, Mintzberg based his approach on that he didn't agree with the design school. So you don't have to necessarily agree with the previous theory. You can disagree and show why your opinions are different. So contingency theory came after classical management, human relations theories and systems theories, and contingency theory then grew into SWOT analysis and organizational culture, leadership theories, game theory and strategy, global management, stakeholder theory. So all these things have an element of contingency theory in them. And again, if we take one particular branch off this tree, stakeholder theory, for example, was originated by a guy called R. Edward Freeman, but of course he had Charles Blackburg, who didn't agree with his version of stakeholder theory, and another series of contributors who've all added their literature, added their ideas and theories to the original one. So it just shows how theory develops, which we've talked about, and how it can be so huge that you need to break it down. So for example, if you go into Google Scholar, which is what I recommend before you start doing a literature search in the Kaiser Library, Google Scholar has a much broader series of databases that it can reach into. So you get a better idea of how much literature is actually out there on a particular subject, even though it might not exist in the Kaiser Library. And we can talk about at some point, well, so if you find something you want but it's not in the library, how do you get to it? Okay? So there are ways of doing it, but we don't need to talk about that right now. If I go into Google Scholar, and I recommend everybody know how to use this because this is important, and I type in a search for management theory, I'll come back with a result of over 3 million things that relate to management theory. Not necessarily articles, but it might be books, it might be all kinds of things. You can, again, delineate the search by saying I only want scholarly articles, I want peer-reviewed articles, and so on. But just at the surface level, I get over 3 million. Well, that would be a pretty broad literature review to plan on doing within one person's lifetime. So I said, well, I'm not so interested in all management theory, I'm more interested in strategic management theory. So I run a search on that. Well, now I've cut it down by about 500,000 articles, and I'm down to 2.5. So I say, well, that's still a little bit more than I want to review. How about if I just look at Porter? So I'm going to look at Porter's strategic management theory. Well, that did a pretty good job, and now I'm down to 33,000 results. What about 5 forces? Well, you can see that we're still in the same ballpark. We cut a few thousand out, but we're still got quite a few articles to have to review. So I decided I'm going to change my focus. I'm going to go after Porter's strategic groups theory. Well, this cut a few more thousand off it, and now I'm down to 28,000. But given that I don't have a lot of time to read 28,000 articles, I'll try to take a different approach. Now I'll search for Henry Mintzberg and Michael Porter, articles that would contain both of them, and here I'm down to 7,000, which seems like a lot, but is much more manageable than the 3 million or so that I originally started with. So what this means is when you start to think about doing a literature search and developing a stream of literature, you really need to narrow it down, because you really can't do an adequate job, and anybody who knows the field would know you can't do a complete review of 2 million articles. You can't tell me everything that's in that particular body of literature. You can't even tell me everything that Michael Porter's done in all his particular areas. But if you go down and you say, well, I'm only going to talk about the differences between what Henry Mintzberg thinks and what Michael Porter thinks, now you're getting down to a manageable level. Some of you in the last discussion referred to, again, how you narrow things down and how you find a particular aspect of a topic that you think is interesting. And when you go in to search that particular aspect, you still find that there are hundreds of articles written about it. So there's very few things that you will come across that nobody has ever written about. Okay, this gets us to the next related topic, which is the seminal versus the germinal literature. Seminal literature, sometimes called foundational or historical literature, forms the origin of a stream of literature. So when I mentioned that Taylor and Weber and Fayol were considered the seminal literature in the field of management, that's because they kind of started what we consider management now. They were kind of the first originators of those ideas. Some might say, well, you could go back further, and we could talk about The Art of War or Machiavelli's The Prince, go back several hundred more years. But in general, if you're talking about strategic management, we'd probably start more with Chandler, Gibson, Ansoff, and Mintzberg, because that was when they started actually using the term strategic management and began applying it in a business environment and talking about business rather than armies or politics. Germinal leadership, germ is the key element of this term, it means it's just starting. So germinal literature is exploring new territory, more recently published. Now, of course, we know how theory is built upon theory, so it's not going to pop out of nowhere. It's going to be based on pre-existing theory. So, for example, what's Michael Porter up to now? Is he retired? No, in fact, he's still publishing, and his concern these days seems to be in the healthcare industry. And he recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is considered, one of those blue chip journals who reject 95% of what people turn in. But he's still writing about his old friend strategy, but now he's talking about how it applies to the healthcare industry. Actually, if you looked at the interview between Charlie Rose and Michael Porter on YouTube, he discusses the same thing. All right, so that kind of covers our topic on literature, but you might ask, so why does it matter? Why do I need to concern? In none of my other classes did I worry about the literature and the streams of literature. Well, why it matters is because when you get to your dissertation, your topic is going to have at least 2 streams of literature. You're going to be well versed in at least 2 areas, all the way back to the seminal work, to the germinal work, and you need to connect those 2 together where these 2 literatures can be synthesized, because that's where your new idea is going to come from. Your new idea is going to come from 2 existing sets of theories of literature that you can then bridge with your own, you might call it a mini theory, your own hypotheses, your own research question, and that's going to be where you're going to do your original research to try to prove it or disprove it. Okay, so understanding streams of literature is very important, because you're going to need to do it to even get approved to do your dissertation topic. Well, can anything be a dissertation topic? Well, if you have 2 streams of literature and a gap, and it seems to be something that's important, then I suppose it could. Whether a dissertation on latte sizes would meet those criteria, I wouldn't be so sure. But I am sure that a dissertation on Baywatch, even in the Department of Marine Biology, is probably not appropriate. So the keys to success. We're going to be identifying the similarities and differences between the theories, but we're going to be looking for things that make them similar and what connects them together and what is carried forward into future theories. There will be divergent points of view, as we've seen. Mintzberg and the design school certainly didn't agree. Mintzberg and Ansoff didn't agree. And Mintzberg and Porter probably don't agree. So you've got to look at the literature and evaluate the validity, not just between those two people, but what other people have written about those theories. Well, sometimes I feel that way too. However, this is going to be important, and you will get better at it. So since we're approaching the halfway point of the class, I decided it's time to shake it up a little bit. So, until next time, goodbye and good luck.